We're happy to celebrate such an exciting day with all of you, and pre-happy World Refugee Day for tomorrow. This event is in partnership with UNHCR, and we're so excited to have this conversation today and then be able to share this conversation more broadly tomorrow via social media. Concordia is a membership organization dedicated to fostering cross-sector partnerships for social impact. If you aren't familiar with Concordia and would like more information, you're welcome to message myself or any of the other Concordia members on our chat today. We also will be holding our 10th annual summit this September digitally with a myriad of partners and sponsors and members for that conversation. If you're interested in attending that summit, again, please email us or contact us directly on the chat feature. A few quick housekeeping rules today. This conversation will be recorded and available afterwards. You will receive an email with a summary of the conversation as well as the footage. We do encourage you to use our chat feature to connect with each other. And we have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions, and we'll have a short Q&A period at the end of this conversation. We have an amazing panel lined up for today, and so there's no need to take up any more time with introductions. So I am very happy to turn it over to our moderator for today, Sam Vinograd.
Kevin, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for joining. My name is Sam Vinograd. I am an advisor to the Concordia Summit and a CNN National Security Analyst. And I'm just really pleased to welcome all of you today for this very important and timely discussion. Currently, we're witnessing the highest number of displaced people on record with over 45 million refugees worldwide. The latest data indicates that over half of those refugees are under the age of 18. They're children. And refugees faced unprecedented challenges before COVID-19. And as many of us know, COVID-19 has exacerbated underlying risks facing refugees while introducing new ones as well. As many of us who have been to the refugee camps understand, social distancing is not an option, and hand washing may be a luxury that many refugees don't have. As we approach World Refugee Day tomorrow, this is the picture facing refugees. And those of us that have done work with refugees understand the challenges they face, as well as the contributions that they make globally. The reality is that they urgently need help. Public sector organizations play a critical role, as do private ones. And that's why I'm so pleased to be joined today by some brilliant and remarkable women who have dedicated their time and so much of their lives to helping refugees globally. I'd like to introduce our panelists briefly, and then we'll jump straight into this discussion. First, I'd like to introduce the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Kelly T. Clements. We're also joined by Shadi Al-Shada, a Partnerships Officer from the Union of Medical Care and Relief Organizations, Rebecca Marmot, Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer from Unilever, Yanti Surepto, President and CEO, Save the Children International, Sherry Weston, President of Global Impact and Philanthropy from the Sesame Workshop, Sarah Bucci, Vice President and Head of Global Programs at the Lego Foundation, and Dr. Nadia Qasim-Bastaki, Vice President, Medical Services and CSR Strategy, Etihad Airways. Kelly, let me start with you. Thank you so much for being with us. I know that UNHCR published, I believe this week, new data with the finding that 100 million people were forced to flee their homes in the last 10 years. I also believe your new data shows that 1% of the world's population has been displaced. Could you paint a picture of the situation that UNHCR is seeing on the ground and explain to us how COVID-19 is affecting refugee populations around the world right now?
Thanks very much, Sam, and thanks to Concordia for putting this program together with World Refugee Day tomorrow. And yesterday, indeed, Sam, you're right. We just came out with our Global Trends Report, which in fact increased from last year. And this is taken at the end of 2019. But since 2018, another 9 million people were forcibly displaced. Refugees and those internally displaced within countries, not crossing borders. Of that, 45 million are internally displaced. Another nearly 30 million are refugees. And these are not temporary movements. We have seen that increasingly people are displaced, not for a month, a year, or even a couple years, but in some circumstances for a lifetime, for a generation. And what we have seen that there are 5 main countries that are driving the displacement we're seeing today. Syria, Venezuela, South Sudan, Myanmar, Afghanistan. Those are the 5 situations. And indeed, as you've mentioned, over the last decade, it's 100 million people that have been forcibly displaced. These are people fleeing war, persecution, conflict. And so you paint that with what's going on now in all corners of the globe with regard to the pandemic. And it's really an emergency on top of an emergency for people that are forced to flee from their homes. We see the pandemic now, as many know, in 216 countries. Over 8 million people are infected. And really the virus is blind to borders. So it does not stop when the border, and it crosses with people, and it is transmitted relatively easily. So it impacts all of us. And what we've seen with regard to the situation of refugees and internally displaced people in COVID is when you have a situation where people may be particularly vulnerable or marginalized, or perhaps outside of national or local health systems, you have a real problem. And what you see in refugee situations is that 85% of them are in developing countries, those that may have more fragile health systems. They are in both rural areas where in fact the health systems may be non-existent or very weak, but they're also in urban areas, which, as you've mentioned, it's crowded, it's difficult to social distance. We've seen this even where you're recording today from the United States and some of the major US cities. So the refugees and displaced, they have kind of a double whammy in a sense. Difficult to find hygiene, soap, water to wash hands, basic precautions and the like. You also have a weak health system that when people get sick, where do they go and how are they aided? This is a recipe for a population that is extremely vulnerable and that one needs to include with regard to any response when it comes to the pandemic. So far, we have not found, Sam, major outbreaks in refugee populations or in internal displacement populations, but the numbers are slowly increasing, and in some areas that we're particularly worried about. We also know that, again, this is not going to be a surprise to any of your viewers, that with limited testing, the infection rates are likely much higher than the official numbers or those tracking mechanisms that we may have currently. Where are we worried? Well, of course, the Americas right now is the epicenter. So we're talking about a lot of people on the move with regard to the Venezuela situation and obviously from countries in Central America. There is still a strong engagement with 1 million Afghan refugees in Iran and how heavily the pandemic has hit that country. In Bangladesh, we have 1 million Rohingya refugees from Myanmar in the southeast part of that country, one of the poorest areas of the country and one of the poorest countries in the world. So in terms of being able to support a population that is very densely living. Places in countries in Africa that concern us, South Africa with high outbreaks, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Senegal. And in the Middle East, we see in Yemen and in Syria, half of the medical facilities actually not even functioning. So again, weak structures to be able to deal with outbreaks. This has painted for us as I mentioned, it's an emergency on top of an emergency. What are we looking at? We're looking at a health emergency, a humanitarian emergency, and a socioeconomic emergency. Because what we've seen, our poverty rates are increasing quite rapidly. People have lost their livelihoods. Many of the refugees and displaced are in the informal sector. And in lockdown situations or in curfew situations, people are not able to work and bring income into their families. And then of course, you mentioned, Sam, the number of children and young people as part of the refugee population, and education has been seriously disrupted. So this is a huge problem in addition to severe food shortages. And in this, the World Food Program just came out this week looking at perhaps 30 million refugees and internally displaced that are food aid dependent, and 21 million between June and August that could actually see a struggle to be able to feed themselves. So a potential of a hunger pandemic on top of COVID-19. So job losses are a huge issue. The issues related to some of the protection risks. We know that about 163 countries have either partially or fully closed their borders, which means people that are fleeing such war and persecution are having difficulties crossing those borders. And we also see scapegoating, discrimination, xenophobia, and we saw that already in a refugee population. Bring a pandemic into the picture and it becomes even worse. So the issues related to protection and decreased access that we have is a big problem. And so what are we doing about this? We're advocating for inclusion. Inclusion, obviously, within the national health systems in order to support. We are reinforcing national and local health systems and mechanisms. In about 36 countries, we are supporting governments actually providing the healthcare. So that's something that we're working very strongly with the World Health Organization to do. We're providing supplies to partners, to first-line responders, to refugee health workers that are actually going out and providing information to their communities. And we're providing cash in many of these countries where refugees have lost their livelihoods. Education becomes a big issue with regard to distance learning and looking at the issues related to the mental health and psychosocial impacts of this pandemic, which becomes so crucial. Over to you.
Kelly, thank you for laying that all out for us and the myriad emergencies on top of the myriad emergencies that already existed, as you discussed. And in a moment, we'll turn to what some members of the private sector are doing to meet these challenges. But first, I want to turn to Shadi. Shadi, you are a refugee, and we're talking about refugees, and it's an honor to have you with us today. I want to start off by asking you why it's so important for you to give back in this moment to help other refugees, as well as in your professional work. What steps and initiatives are you taking during COVID-19 as you undertake your work helping refugees at the moment?
Thank you for having me. Let me start by saying, like, the refugee camps are growing larger and larger. The society of those displaced, as you just said, is 80 million, is 10 times Switzerland, where I live now. And inside of the fact that this population of refugees is growing so rapidly that it has the highest percentage of growing. 10 years ago, it was only 40 million, as I know. Today, it's 80 million, double the number. This meeting is important. Thank you for having me, for giving me the voice, and for organizing it. To answer the question, I would say, like, at the beginning of COVID-19, we knew that people at older age are more likely at risk. The fact that daily life could suddenly become difficult is something we as refugees know very well. And this brought the idea that we can and we should help those people in doing their daily routine things like grocery, medicine, post, any daily little things. We could help with. These people are usually capable of doing these tasks, these daily tasks. At some certain point, they were at risk to do that. And we gathered one another, supported one another to start organizing and supporting, having these little but important daily needs. In fact, to be a refugee, it would no doubt mean that you've been through a crisis, and hence you've learned from previous experiences that in a time when a crisis hit, sometimes you need to act, you need to count on one another, to support one another, before even governmental or non-governmental, with all respect, but before these bodies would establish and put in a place a responding plan. That's why the first thing we did when the idea crossed our mind was to make few phone calls to NGOs, active ones that we admire, that we adore, to municipalities here in Geneva and around. Everyone referred us to another person, another NGO, another actor to contact. Soon, I realized that it is too early to expect that any institution, anybody would have a plan in place, but at the same time, it's too urgent to wait for this. That's why I sent a WhatsApp message to friends, refugees like me, suggested this idea, asked for their feedback, for their comments. An hour later, we were a dozen of volunteers. The same night, we've drafted our policies, we've drafted or defined our safety and security measures. we decided where and how shall each of us work and how it all started. Let me please go back to a point in the question itself. Why was it important to give back? I wonder actually if we were intending to give back. Personally, I was not intending to give back. I just did what I felt that I should do, what is my responsibility. In fact, the title of that campaign that I said, like it was defined from the afternoon till the evening, it was defined and even written, that the slogan of that campaign was, without discussion, without brainstorming, without meeting, without all that, it was because responsibility, because solidarity is as well a human responsibility. That was the title. And what we did was just a basic human responsibility toward our communities. We did what we felt we can do. Personally, it wasn't giving back, it was belonging. Belonging to this community, it means as well having common rights and duties and responsibility toward the community itself. A short, if the time allow me, just a short background. I studied law back in Syria. When I was in high school, I never thought of studying law. The war on Iraq, the refugees, Iraqis coming to Syria, facing ordinary challenges, made me rethink of how little things could be a challenge. And hence I studied law to hopefully one day support them further. Before that day comes to reality, I became myself in a place where I had to face these challenges, these daily difficulties as a refugee in Egypt and then in Switzerland, when the culture is different, where the laws are different, where little daily things that could be just normal for anyone could be a challenge, difficult for me. I could overcome all these challenges and difficulties, or most of these difficulties, I hope, through the support of the community, of individuals, of families, of the community itself, with all its bodies, and to have this support. It's actually a symbolic support. A symbolic support in the sense of helping me to send a letter, introducing me to someone, introducing me to a story, to a building, to something local, to a product. This helped to invite me to a dinner. This symbolic support helps you to belong, and once you belong, you're kind of more active. But I need to stress one point, that in order for this symbolic support to be impactful, memorable, to last for long, to be meaningful, it needs to be based on respect, on understanding, on equality. I mention all that to say that we, as refugees, we understand very much how little gestures could be highly appreciated and long-lasting. The only thing I would regret in this experience, that when we started this in the same day, we used the word vulnerable population. And after a few days, I started to regret, because we used the word that everyone was using. And I felt like when I'm doing that, when I'm helping these people, most of them, many of them were more sportive than me, were more capable than me physically even. It just at certain point, in certain conditions, without any choice for them, they were vulnerable towards something, and we called them vulnerable. And this is the same for refugees. This is remind me of myself when I'm called vulnerable for something I didn't choose. And here I just started to think, like, am I vulnerable or not? Are they or not? And I just felt that I just was excluded in the sense I was uprooted from my home. And that means from my family, from my friends, from my contacts, from my job, from my education, from my university. Uprooted, taken, displaced from what empowers me as a human. What surrounds me is what empowers me. That's why belonging to this community, it's also empowering me. And I did it not because it empowers me, but because through it I'm powerful. Last thing to mention, that thwarted belongingness becomes at some point for a refugee like me the most difficult and long-lasting challenge until you belong to the community. And to take a chance, since there are business leaders here with us, working is one of the best and most dignified ways of belonging again to the community, of re-belonging to a community. It's probably not a way, it's a highway. To overcome that, we need to get to work, to belong to the community. Otherwise, we would commit suicide, even if suicide here is not ending a life, but ending a social life. Commit a social life suicide. Over to you. Sorry for long.
Shadi, thank you for that and for sharing your firsthand experiences and the need for employment for refugees worldwide. I want to turn for a second to something I mentioned at the outset, which is the incredible number of child refugees that are currently exist around the world, including in the countries, Kelly, that you mentioned in particular. Yanti, your work is focused on helping vulnerable children. What's one of the biggest challenges that refugee children are facing, specifically as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? And what concrete initiatives has Save the Children taken to meet that challenge and others?
Thanks, Sam, and thank you, Concordia, for organizing this as always, and thank you, Shadi. That was great to hear, and very important point about language actually that you make there. Kelly has already outlined a lot of the issues, and we see them, of course, be very prevalent for children in particular. I would perhaps hone in a little bit on two of those. And Kelly's absolutely right. Of course, often children that we see have been a refugee their whole life. They were born being a refugee, and they're still a refugee. And by the time they should enter into their working ages, they're probably still a refugee. The average age hovers somewhere between 15 to 17 years, I think. So that's certainly a childhood, if not a whole life. What we've seen COVID do, so all essential services are already weak in most countries and are an issue for these children: health, education, protection. What we see COVID do in particular is really disrupting the services that host governments, NGOs like Save the Children and many others, UNHCR and partners, are trying to help children with. So education, well, over 1 billion kids are out of school today in all countries, but this is particularly hitting, of course, refugee children hard. By the way, half of refugee children were already out of school. So what we're trying to provide, that even temporary settings, temporary school classrooms now had to shut. So that is particularly disruptive. That also increases actually the risk of protection. These schools, these child-friendly spaces, these girls' education centers that we run in refugee camps, in Zaatari, in Cox's Bazar, and others, are also a really important mechanism to make sure that girls in particular are safe. And that currently that mechanism is also gone. There are fewer eyes on vulnerable children. And what you also see is that, and we've seen this in previous pandemics for all children, when schools are closed for a long time, it's very difficult to get the poorest children often don't go back to school, even when they reopen. We saw it after Ebola, and we're worried that we're going to see it now. The poorest kids do not go back because when the schools closed, they were either put to work, or were marginalized, or were trafficked, or put at risk in any other form. So it's hard for them to go back because the families quite often are not in a position to have them go back. Girls are being at much higher risk now than before to be married off whilst they can't go to school. So we'll see that. We saw an increase in girl marriage in West Africa after the Ebola pandemic, as a lot of my colleagues on this call will know. So those are the particular issues for children that we see being highlighted because of this crisis. Now, what are we doing about it? We work in the vast majority, in actually all, I think, of the countries that Kelly mentioned, and then some. We really had to adapt. Of course, a lot of the stuff that we do, running schools, centers for girls, etc., we had to physically close or do it in different ways. We had to, of course, take all the safety precautions around protective equipment, materials, distancing. We adapted most of our programs to really go, as large scale as we can, to go to, sometimes low resource tech. This isn't about handing out tablets and a laptop in every tent or community. This is about using national TV, broadcasters, radio is hugely effective in this space. We're using SMS, WhatsApp for kids to send their homework back to teachers so that there's still a method to keep normalcy running. We're using, in Ethiopia and a couple of countries in Africa, we're using partnerships with churches and mosques to use their way of broadcasting to the wider community. It enhances, by the way, ownership of the community, but it also gives us a fantastic mechanism to get messaging out around continuing education, the importance for girls and girls' rights to not be married off, etc. So we're using tried and tested mechanisms that are already used for communication in those communities to the best of our abilities. And it also really highlights the digital divide again. Connectivity was already an issue for many refugees and in many, even in the country where I'm a guest now in the United States, that was an issue where connectivity is by far not normal everywhere. So that it highlights that problem even starker, because people who have problems being connected now will have more problems catching up and having some of these adaptive programs delivered to them. We're training extra community health workers, because until we've got pharmaceutical interventions, treatments, vaccines, we have to rely on those communities being able to do the basic stuff themselves, from hand washing, so hygiene practices, distancing, being careful with social gatherings, etc. And those are really cultural and behavioral interventions, even in settings where high density makes it super hard. So we're training community health workers. We're particularly interested in helping train more youth to do that. There's huge numbers of youth particularly in Africa and in Asia and the Middle East that are where already employment was an issue, and it's an army of potential that we can really use there to help their own communities and to help them be safe. We've ramped up our cash. As Kelly was saying, that's a particularly useful intervention. We know that at the best of times, but also at times of COVID. Now is the time that families need a cash injection to make sure that they can take care of their families in the way that they choose and they think is the most appropriate at this time. And then on education, learning loss is our biggest issue. Even as kids in the United States go into the longest summer holiday of their lives, we will need to make sure that all these months of reduced learning can be both mitigated against, as well as helping kids catch up. And we did this in the Ebola pandemic as well. Afterwards, we introduced programs like accelerated learning. Can we help children who haven't been to school, maybe in 1 year, 2 years, help them catch up for the national curriculum, ideally in a reduced number of months, in order to get ready for national exams again, so that they can get back into the formal education system that they were taken out of. So that's a big push for Save the Children and our partners to think about going forward, because this is not over by any stretch of the imagination. We're not out of it in many, many countries. We might go back into lockdown in a number of countries, as we see. So what if this blended way of schooling and education is going to continue, with schools in and out, with shifts, with being half in the classroom, half out of the classroom? How can we help teachers in particular, and parents as well as schools, to prepare for that and to offer solutions to help children either catch up, extra tutorial measures, or make sure that whilst at home they can continue some of their learnings? And we're delivering, we're being very creative here. Our staff on the ground in particular is the most creative staff I've ever met. We're delivering books and learning materials via bicycles, via camels, or via school buses, as it is in the United States. But we're using whatever means we can find in our context that are helpful and effective and we know can work. So that's what we're doing. The importance of partnerships, and that's why I'm always delighted to be at Concordia, is super important. No one can do this on their own. Some of our corporate partners have really stepped up their work, either their existing work, which they've plussed up, and we've found many new corporate partners who are really now keen to actually see how they can help in this space, either by providing their expertise, their skills, their funding, their products, and ideally all of the above, to make sure that we can actually help these kids and refugees in general get through this. So let me stop there and hand it back to you, Sam.
Yanti, thank you. And keeping with the theme of children and education, and you mentioned television as well, I want to now turn to Sherry Weston from Sesame Workshop. Sherry, I grew up watching Sesame in English, and more recently as a grown-up, I've watched Sesame in Arabic, and the work that Sesame has done to portray a refugee child as a character in your Arabic language programming. What insights can you share in adapting Sesame's work to meet the increasing needs and challenges emerging from COVID-19, this current environment that is facing children around the world? I think that we may have lost Sherry. Okay, there you go.
Okay, good. Sorry. I was saying I'm thrilled you grew up watching Sesame Street. It's clearly why you're so successful and
Indeed.
so good. So listen, I as a little bit of background, I always, I apologize, but I always have to do this because so many people really think of Sesame Street as the show they grew up watching, and particularly the domestic US television show. And so it's important to understand that at Sesame Workshop, which is the nonprofit that produces Sesame around the world, that we are global, that we're reaching children in over 150 countries. But more than that, and what I think is the most impactful, is in many of those countries, we're creating completely local productions. So they're designed to meet the needs of children in that country with their own language, their own culture, even their own Muppets with storylines that they can identify with, because we know children learn best when they're seeing themselves. So if you also think about what a long history Sesame has had in terms of really tackling tough issues. You know, one of the first children's shows to deal with real life issues, death, loss, and around the world, HIV and AIDS in South Africa, I could go on and on, girls in Afghanistan. And so because that's something we're always doing, is looking at where can we address issues and challenges from a child's perspective. And particularly now when there's so much neuroscience to show how debilitating it is on their healthy brain development to be dealing with traumatic events and adverse childhood experiences. So as you can imagine, you know, during the height of the Syrian crisis, with the largest number of people displaced since World War II, almost half of whom were children, we knew we had to do something to help. But partnerships is so important because we are not a direct service provider. We can create proven educational content and use the power of media to reach children all over the world, many of whom who don't have access to quality early learning. But again, we're not that organization on the ground doing direct services. So we formed a partnership with the International Rescue Committee, you know, after a lot of sort of analysis, and there's so many great organizations we partner with on the ground. For this, we chose IRC because they were focused specifically on refugees, and we wanted someone who knew as much about the needs of refugees as we knew about the needs of young children. And we began a pilot in Jordan to take some of our Arabic content and begin to test it, empowering those IRC staff on the ground with this content. That was when MacArthur Foundation, which I'm sure you all know, announced their first ever 100 and Change Award. And we decided we should apply. You never think you're going to actually win. But when 19 months later, we were selected for our partnership with the IRC, it enabled us to create the largest early childhood intervention in the history of humanitarian response, and really shine a spotlight on the fact that less than 3% of all aid goes to education, you know, only a tiny fraction of that to early education. We created a program called Ahlan Simsim, which means welcome sesame in Arabic. And that had three main components, and this is pre-COVID. It was mass media, so we could use digital and YouTube and broadcast to create the most children. You know, that gives us an opportunity to create children, to reach children at scale. And that's not only displaced children, but their neighbors and host communities. And that allows us to model inclusion and acceptance with new Muppets with storylines. One left his home, becomes best friends with another, all very powerful. And with a deep curriculum on the emotional, socio-emotional ABCs, if you will, that we know children need to build resilience. So that's one component. Then it's creating content based on these popular characters and this new content that will be used and sort of empowering the IRC staff on the ground, whether that's home visits, learning centers, clinics, particularly to help engagement with adults and to promote nurturing care, which we all know is the most important thing to mitigate the effects of trauma on young children. And then third, and really equally importantly, was research. And we partnered with NYU so that they would be able to test outcomes. We would do randomized control trials. We will literally almost triple the amount of evidence on what's most effective for children in crisis that we'll share with the world. We want everyone to learn from our mistakes, our pivots, what works, what doesn't, so these can be replicated and truly transformational. And then I have to say, within a year, the Lego Foundation, another long-term partner, stepped up. I think they had been inspired by the MacArthur Foundation's audacious philanthropy and decided to invest another $100 million in deepening our work in the Middle East with learning through play and allowing us to expand that work to meet the Rohingya crisis, to reach children in Bangladesh in host communities and the Rohingya camps. And that has been an enormous opportunity to do just what we hoped, to replicate, to transform, and to hope that this becomes a catalyst for others to step up. Now COVID hits. And as you can imagine, that has a huge impact on what we're doing. What I will say is it really speaks to the power of media. And the one great thing is what Sesame has always done. I mean, we're 50 years old and we were started specifically to see if you could use media to give less advantaged children and those who didn't have the access to the same quality preschools, the ability to arrive at school ready to learn. So when you realize that that is what we're doing today, is we can reach children even in isolation. We can reach children and provide incredible resources and content and especially strategies for parents and caregivers to engage their children in playful learning and to give content that will be valuable during this time. So we immediately pivoted in terms of what content we were creating. So there is a whole body of work called Caring for Each Other that is global, that is not only basic early learning and strategies to incorporate play and learning at home, but also prevention and health and the tools to help children with anxiety and to manage this is very traumatic for both adults and children. So I'm so proud that we were able to really pivot in terms of what we were producing. But again, it spoke to the power of using media and digital to reach families even in these circumstances, because we have had to disrupt in-person home visits, play labs in Bangladesh, learning centers, as you all well know. I am really pleased. We also did things like we created an all-new family special called For Ahlan Simpson, which was like a virtual play day that was broadcast in over 20 countries in the Middle East and on YouTube. And again, giving parents and families tools to engage children during these times. Again, thanks to the Lego Foundation, our partner, they have given us a grant to now create similar family specials that just launched this week. It's called Elmo's World News. It's quite adorable. And that is, now in almost 60 countries and 30 some languages. So giving access to this content even when families are isolated. Mm-hmm. The other thing I will mention is that in Bangladesh, we are, we quickly pivoted both with the IRC in the Middle East using WhatsApp to provide this content to families has been very effective. And with our partners BRAC in Bangladesh, we've been doing good old-fashioned phone calls, and you'd be amazed at how effective it is with trained BRAC staff who are now calling regularly. Those they would have been doing home visits with, they're able to call. We're doing text follow-ups. And I think it's also important to understand, because the research is so important, that we're now pivoting our research. We're having to do much of it by phone, by digital, but it's so important that we test what are the outcomes of these new strategies of WhatsApp, of digital, of basic phone calls so that we can at least measure how effective it is. Because what we want to do when this, you know, as Yanti said, it's going to be a while, but when there is a new normal, what did we learn? Are some of these strategies things we should keep doing even when we're back in person? And absolutely, are we going to be able to share them so that others can use them wherever there are places that you can't reach children and families directly? We also know how important it is to be giving tools to the caregivers and parents themselves, and how important it is to enlighten them on how valuable play can be, how valuable interaction with their children can be, and to give them those tools. So I feel like I'm sort of, I could go on and on about this, but I think in the end, the most important thing is that we build back better, that we pivot as much as we can, learn from being innovative at how we can intervene even in these incredibly challenging times, and that we know what we can do to enhance our work when we're back in a situation where we can't have in-person contact.
Sherry, thank you for all of that. And you mentioned the LEGO Foundation, so let me now turn to Sarah. Sarah, can you tell us about the work that the LEGO Foundation is doing related to COVID-19, and just more generally, how that fits into the broader mission of the LEGO Foundation?
Certainly. Well, thanks so much, Sam, for the opportunity to be on this panel and to follow such great partners like Sherry and Yanti and Kelly too. I think we're really proud to be able to be a part of the kind of response that all three of their organizations are making right now. Maybe I should just start by saying a word about the LEGO Foundation. We are a Danish foundation that really looks at redefining play and reimagining learning. And we do that by working with partners across the globe to implement the kinds of programs that make children's lives better. And we think the best way to do that is to put playful learning on a global agenda. It's important to know what we mean at the LEGO Foundation by playful learning is those kinds of experiences that a learner has when they are joyful and actively engaging and iterative and meaningful and what we would call socially interactive. And when these 5 characteristics work together, research has shown that it motivates children, it helps let stick more with over time. It really ensures that they are processing things, turn to it more quickly, and it helps us to build an environment where learning can be scaffolded so that if you've got children who are at different levels, you can more easily reach where they're at so that you can meet them where they are. We know that is so critical to a positive learning experience. And we can see then with research that that learning through play experience helps to develop physical skills, cognitive skills, the social and emotional skills that we know are so important, and the creative skills. And together, those kinds of different types of learning are what we feel really will help to set children up for the best kind of future, and that they can be interconnected. So it's important to set that context about what it is that the LEGO Foundation believes and is trying to do with our philanthropy generally. In March of this year, we made a decision with our colleagues in the LEGO Group, which is a sister organization. We're not actually a part of the company, but to make a $50 million donation to support children who are most in need during the pandemic. And specifically to look at how we could help partners around the world really increase the learning through play that they put together. And I think it's important to stop and note that what we know about learning through play and is that it helps children, particularly those that have experienced adversity and trauma, or who are going through stressful situations, to process that stress and process the adversity in a way that builds resilience. And therefore, now is a moment where sort of our mission and what we think, there is so much more receptivity toward thinking about playful learning. Not to mention, we're seeing a major shift in where children are learning and how they're learning. And that sort of redefinition of education is really important to us as we look at the pivot and the shift that the world needs to make to ensure not only that children learn during the pandemic, but what we believe is how children should learn every day. So with that $50 million commitment, we set up quickly 4 different streams of work. But to do that, we were trying to figure out how could we both be immediately responsive and leverage what we bring as the LEGO Group and the LEGO Foundation with our own resources. We wanted to make sure that the pledge that we made was really reaching children who are facing multiple adversities in this moment, and to help to advocate for them, and particularly in the early years, and particularly around this idea of learning through play. As Sherry said, you know, this idea of building systems back better was really important. And then with all of what is going on, we felt like it's a moment to really promote the kind of transformational thinking that we think learners so urgently deserve in this world. And that has led us to these 4 areas of work. The first thing, we put together our own playlist. So we have a wonderful set of partners around the world who do playful learning activities in schools and in homes and with after-school centers and with parents and in home visits. And as a result, we have access to this enormous sort of library of different activities of how can you help to build cognitive skills, or what are ways to promote gross motor or fine motor skills. So what we've done is to curate this playlist that is now available on our website, and we're starting to populate even further, that gives ideas for families about how they can help their children play and learn at home. And we're really excited about that piece, and then a campaign that we're doing with the LEGO Group around it to help ensure that parents really understand what learning through play can do for their children to help them during this time, not only cope with their feelings and the anxieties that might come up, but also to really ensure that they have the kinds of problem solving and learning that we think is important. We've also really looked on putting our efforts into understanding distance learning solutions. And this includes in refugee settings where we know that the digital divide, as Yanti spoke to earlier, is enormous. I think Kelly also said something about that. And we know that we need to really investigate and share the resources that work. So whether that's radio broadcasting or paper leaflets or television or mobile phones, all kinds of different things, we're trying to see what works best and how we can make it more available. And use that moment not just to reproduce what a classroom environment would be, but to create this playful learning experience that we think helps stick with children longer and better and in a more meaningful way. We've also worked with the LEGO Group to give away more than 70 small grants across 20 different countries that are prioritizing crisis response services, mental health, psychosocial support, and then education and learning. And then we've reached out to our partners and we've asked them, what do you need and how can we help? And importantly, when you do that, how can you make learning through play more central in what you do? So we're trying to meet each other together around what the LEGO Foundation wants to accomplish and what our partners who are very steeped in understanding on the ground what is needed. And I just want to mention, importantly, as part of that, one of our partners is Education Cannot Wait, and we gave a grant in the early fall that was trying to say we need to spread more attention toward children in crisis in particular. But with our next round of funding with Education Cannot Wait, we asked them to really prioritize refugees in their response, because often refugees are overlooked. And then also making sure as part of 10% of the funding would go toward early childhood education, because we know that neurological development is so important at that point. And that we would really look at how the response window would include learning through play. So we're really excited to see what comes out of that second round of the first emergency response window is open now, and the next round of grants will come out in July. So we're really pleased to be a part of that.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing how that all turns out for sure in our next conversation. I'm just going to jump in just in the interest of time.
Sure.
And just briefly, I know that we're getting close to the 11 a.m. hour, which is the end of our formal program. So Sarah, I'll let you finish in a moment. But just for everybody watching, we still have 2 more incredible panelists to go to. before getting into the Q&A. But as we're getting close to the end of the formally scheduled time, I want to thank all of our panelists, and in particular, Deputy High Commissioner Kelly T. Clements. Thank you so much for being with us and for all the work that you do. And now, Sarah, I'll turn it back to you to finish, and then we'll turn to our other two panelists.
Sure, and I'll just very briefly mention, I think the two lessons that I wanted to sort of draw out of how this work is really affecting where we're going long term. It's to remember that this moment is also really causing people to rethink a lot of delivery systems and rethink how it is that children can and should deserve what kind of services are available to them. So we need to really seize this moment and take it to rethink delivery systems altogether. And then, you know, we often say in the LEGO Foundation that phrase questions and try to give people a sense of there isn't only one answer. That's what learning through play does. It allows you to look at things from multiple sides. That we need to continue to think as a community that's responding to this and responding together that there are multiple solutions to the same problem. And that's definitely something we're seeing with the pandemic. Thanks.
Sarah, thank you. And you know, from so many of our panelists, it sounds like there are lessons learned from this experience that will be able to be applied once we mitigate this current crisis and can get back to whatever the new normal looks like. I'd like to turn now to Rebecca. Rebecca, can you talk to us about what steps Unilever has taken to adapt during the pandemic, and just more generally what you're doing to support refugees around the world as well?
Hi everybody, yes, good morning and good afternoon. Thanks so much for inviting me to join the panel. As a business, Unilever has always been committed to working with refugees, both in terms of what we can do with immediate relief and rehabilitation, but also in terms of longer term advocacy. So even months into the pandemic, and until we have a vaccine, we all know that soap is the best line of defense. So as one of the world's largest soap and hygiene product manufacturers with brands like Lifebuoy and Domestos, we knew that in terms of refugees, there was an immediate role that we had to play. And we've heard lots from some of the other panelists about the particular set of circumstances and challenging living conditions for refugees and displaced people, frequently at risk during the coronavirus pandemic, perhaps because of a physical lack of access to clean water, sanitation systems, health facilities, etc., but also often living in multi-generational families without social distancing. So we wanted to ensure that when we looked at our coronavirus response, that we put a particular emphasis on what we could do in terms of refugee populations. So I think two key areas really to talk about, firstly on the product portfolio, and then secondly on what we've tried to do in terms of private sector business expertise. I'm delighted to be sharing the panel with Kelly today. As part of our global partnership with UNHCR, we've done a lot of work together looking at sanitation and hygiene access of refugees and host communities. So we've donated now about 30 million bars of soap to be distributed through 40 different locations in Africa, in Latin America and in Asia. And also through our partnership with Direct Relief, we've done a lot of work with providing vital health and hygiene supplies, particularly again focused on refugee populations. But I think the second area around business expertise is something that we've really tried to utilise and leverage to the max. So, for example, here in the UK, we've been partnering with the government, the UK Department for International Development, on a £100 million hygiene and behaviour change coalition, where we've aimed to reach 1 billion people worldwide to raise awareness and change behaviour on key hygiene practices around good hand washing, around good sanitation. So looking at how can we adapt and utilise some of the work that we've amassed over the years on behaviour change programmes, and how can we best get campaigns and communications campaigns, marketing campaigns that focus on how to communicate that. So as part of that coalition, there's about 15 NGOs and UN agencies with a particular focus on reaching, for example, Syrian and Rohingya refugees, as well as a lot of work in Myanmar, in Pakistan, and DRC, South Sudan, and in Cameroon. Just give an example of what that looks like, because I know we're short on time. We're doing a lot of work at the moment with UNHCR and IRC in Cox's Bazar, looking at how can we adapt Lifebuoy's Mum's Magic Hands program, which is a Lifebuoy program that's been specifically developed for for use in emergency settings. And we're looking at now how we expand that and we roll it out in other refugee settlements, for example, in Lebanon with UNHCR. And then I think just the last point to mention is, in addition to the work that we're doing at the moment on immediate relief, I think longer term, and there's been a lot of talk about build back, how do we build back stronger? There's been a big emphasis on putting the green recovery at the centre of government stimulus packages. But of course, the other big element is around protecting livelihoods and job creation, which is going to be hugely essential around the world. So what we've tried to do when we look at that through a refugee lens is build on some of the work we've been doing with one of our brands, Ben & Jerry's, and supporting refugee communities and helping to protect livelihoods. So a couple of years ago, we launched an advocacy campaign in Europe, which focused on the right to work for refugees coming to Western Europe. Partnered with a group called the Entrepreneurial Refugee Network to launch what we called an Ice Cream Entrepreneurs Academy to help focus on job creation and entrepreneurship programs specifically targeted at refugees. And then we launched a special ice cream flavor to really try and build widespread awareness and support around the issue. So what we're doing now with that program is really stepping up the activism across those European communities to highlight how COVID is disproportionately affecting people seeking safety. So for example, in detention centres or maybe stuck in the camps at the borders, some of the EU countries, for perhaps whom access to healthcare is guaranteed because of their immigration status. So I'll stop there. There's a ton of things I would love to talk about, but I think hopefully that gives you a sense of what we're trying to do in terms of immediate relief through products and through partnering, the behaviour change programs that we're working on in the communications, and then longer term on the advocacy and trying to ensure that element of refugee employment and livelihood protection is built into the packages when governments are looking at how to provide economic stimulus post the COVID response.
Rebecca, thank you for that. And before we turn to Nadia and conclude our formal program, I just want to say goodbye to Deputy High Commissioner Kelly T. Clements. Kelly, if you're still with us, thank you so much for joining, and just wondering if you have any last words.
Thanks a lot, Sam. And I'm just delighted to be on a panel with such brilliant people and devoted activists and engagers. And I think this is the key. You know, each of you are talking about what contribution you're making, and there's a whole lot that the private sector to business to individuals can make. It's not just about giving resources, but it's also giving talents, innovative solutions in other ways to, as Shadi said, allow refugees to rebuild their own futures and be able to take some control in terms of their destinies. And I think that's very important. And we can't do it alone. And we've got fantastic partners on the screen with you. And so we're delighted to continue to partner. And thanks again to Concordia and to you, Sam, for putting this together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Nadia, I'd love to turn to you to hear about the work that Etihad is doing during this time and how you've adapted your business generally, and more broadly, just how you envisage the role of business in helping to address the refugee crisis.
Hi, thank you for having me, and I would like to thank all the panelists who are with us today and all their contribution to us refugee. Of course, it's a major role for businesses today, or private businesses, to come in, NGOs and other sectors, to create the ecosystem. And it was always important, and even in time of crisis or a pandemic, it's very critical that businesses step up, redirect themselves in terms of saying, okay, my business, or what is my core values? And it's important that we go back to those core values that we're focused on. And in matter of crisis, things can become very stressful, and businesses can be stressed out because of their economic or whatever outcome they have. But it's also important to be calm and look at the bigger picture. It's important to do that collaboration between governments internally and externally and focus on your partnerships. And this is how we can fight the fight together, because it's a global pandemic. So working in silos wouldn't help. And it's important that bringing people together at this time is the key. Bringing different partners together, looking at the most, what is our vulnerability matrix? Where do we want to focus our our thoughts and our direction to, and the businesses now have to redirect what they were doing in the normal times. So as you know, when it comes to airline industry, the most affected, we are the most affected industry, around 63 billion losses as IATA reported. And when we looked at it as an Etihad perspective, we went back to our core value. What is our core value? And being under the UAE, as you all know, the UAE is very vast in thinking about AIDS and how to help the world. And we being an international kind of airline, and also being a very core of airline, national airline, where we need to envision the same. So our kind of whole directive changed, and we started thinking about how can we help rather than. So initially we used to bring passengers from one end to another, and I thought, okay, now we thought, how can we redirect this? And today our focus then changed from passengers, because most of our flights were grounded. We focused on how to bring supplies to people that are most in need. So, people that require the PPE, how can we help governments and different countries to bring those PPEs into them as quick as possible? We focused on cargo. We didn't focus on, we made sure that these supplies are available around the clock to different countries. We flew countries that we never have flown before, just to ensure that we do that supply. We also put ourselves into programs such as food support programs, worked with the government, food safety programs, to ensure that we are now sending food for the most vulnerable. And we looked at Yemen and Syria and other countries surrounding us as well. And then finally, we looked at all these employees now who are working from home, and our cabin crew and pilot populations who are not flying. What do we do with them? And then we ensured that we do a volunteering program that we connect them together. And mainly, we then looked at, we flew 17.5 million passengers in 2019 and 2020. How can we bring them now to help us support the crisis? And this is where we looked at our partner, the UNHCR, and made sure that our passengers are now in that loop, and said, this is the time for you to donate your miles, and this is a time for us to match those miles. And we created that big platform where we created awareness for UNHCR, ensuring that we bring our passengers and ourselves into this equation, collecting as much as donation as possible, and then giving it back to our refugees in terms of hand sanitization, masks and ventilators, and whatever else they would require during the pandemic. So I think the structure we worked with was defining our core value, bringing the ecosystem together, and making sure we help the most vulnerable. And I think if the businesses go back and do the same equation, I think we can have a better community and a better world out there. So thank you so much. I know you guys are running late. I had to make a short summary, but I could do best.
Well, Nadia, thank you. And we're going to transition into Q&A. But before we do so, I mean, I think to sum up this discussion, we've heard so much about the partnerships between public and private sector entities and how they've grown during this period. And I hope that this is just a model that's going to continue as we go forward, particularly as so many of our panelists have noted that this current crisis won't end anytime soon. It's going to have a very long tail. And so with that, let's transition into Q&A. I'm going to turn to my colleague, Kevin, to flag some of the questions from our viewers.
Great, thanks everybody. Actually, we have two people that asked the same question, basically, which I think shows something that everybody is really interested in, which is basically, if you're looking out a year from now, what metrics are you planning to use to gauge success or failure with your programming that you're working on?
Well, should we just go through the panelists briefly? Let's start with Sarah from Lego.
Yeah, I mean, so for us, the learning aspect of things is really important. So we don't necessarily see failure, but see it as an iteration. So how can you get to the next loop? And increasingly, what we want to do is make sure that the initiative or the activity is significant, that it is, so that it really makes a change in children's lives, that it's sustainable so that it can go on beyond us, and that it is lasting so that the individual behavior change takes place over a longer period of time. And we know that starts small and you figure things out and then you get it to go bigger, and that is continually there. So if we learn and something doesn't work, that is fine. It really is fine. I think the other thing that I would point out is this idea of transformational change and really getting people to think about what should children learn and how differently is important to us.
Sarah, thank you. Yanti, how about you from Save the Children's perspective? What metrics will you be using to measure success?
And as of today, we're very focused on, are we able to continue services, right? How many kids do we still help with their education or with their protection? How many? So those are the sort of the triggers that we're tracking now. But of course, if you talk 12, 18, 24 months out, it's really important that we look, as Sarah has said and as Sherry has said, if you move to a blended form of education, if we move to also blended forms of doing child protection via phone calls instead of home visits, etc., how do we still apply our normal outcome indicators to these things? Will kids still be able to pass national education tests if they go through our accelerated learning program, for instance? And some of these things are relatively easy to measure, like outcomes on learning tests, literacy tests, etc. Some of the things around protection and will girls stay out of early child marriage, of course, are much more longitudinal, will take longer and are slightly more, have to be a bit more creative to find ways to measure that. So it will be a mix, and I certainly buy into to Sarah's point around we really have to learn our way and into this.
Thank you. And let's just get one more question from Kevin, and then I'll turn to the other panelists to answer the first question and potentially the second as well, just in the interest of time.
Yeah, this is actually a question that I have. At Concordia, throughout this entire, crazy time that we're living in, we've really been trying to identify opportunities for us to rethink systems that we are doing and what, to what Dr. Nadia was talking about, what our core rationale as an organization is for existing. And so I'm curious if there are silver linings or opportunities that you have seen in your organization or companies that are lessons you can learn from sort of this rethinking and restructuring in this time that you think will actually allow you to be a new and different organization and operate in a different way that you can take with you in the future.
Rebecca, let's turn to you with the two combined questions.
Thank you. So I think on the immediate work that we're doing at the moment in partnership with the different UN agencies and NGOs, we have standard impact measurements around our hygiene and sanitation programs. So looking at the sustained behavior change, making sure, for example, that the programs we're doing that encourage people to wash their hands at the 5 key points during the day are ingrained behavior. We can look at the positive, hopefully, correlation that has on reducing, for example, dysentery and diarrhea. I think to Kevin's point around longer term and what that means for the organisation, for Unilever overall as a consumer goods company, clearly there are a raft of different things in terms of looking at, for example, portfolio shifts. We've seen a huge uptake in demand for, and it won't surprise you, sanitizers, soaps, cleaning products, hygiene products, an increased move towards protection in terms of improvements in diet, health and well-being, etc. But I think the really big learning that applies most in this context is a rapid acceleration of digital. So when I look at how we've taken what was a face-to-face program on behavior change, it was the world's largest behavior change on hand washing with soap, we quickly had to look at how could we take those learnings and shift them to online, to digital, where social distancing is obviously a huge part of getting this program out more widely. So I think when you think about the positive ramifications on e-learning, on e-health programs, while we're still having to live in a world that is impacted so much by COVID-19, for us, I would say digital and ensuring that we can adapt programs to be used in a digital format is probably the biggest shift.
Thank you for that. And just finally and briefly, Sherry, Shadi, and Nadia, could you just chime in on the general question of lessons learned?
I think from my end, what we learned as an organization is working from home. And that was something, so we had an organization which was 24/7 operational in offices. And what we learned is transformation through digitalization and working from home worked really well with an organization as big as us. And it worked in terms of we learned how to engage people much better. We learned how to put a framework around working from home, how to conduct meetings, how to do e-learnings. And we had a partially transformation on that, but this is a full transformation for all the teams to work from home. So we had a big population of people working from home. We looked at the productivity, but also we looked at the end result of what that will look like in the overall business. It will give us saving on, building spaces and so on. So this is what a key turner, and we're moving towards that technology and how to enhance it for our business and also for our passengers, how we can use that in terms of touchless journey, how they can feel safe and going back to flying. And this is something that we really want to kind of focus on in the future.
Thank you. And maybe Sherry and then Shadi.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, I think that almost the answers are similar for us in terms of the quantifying. We will measure success, and it'll be both quantitative and qualitative. To what Yanti said, we will still care about reaching the numbers we had intended. So in terms of how many we reach, even if it's in different ways, but most importantly, being able to measure the quality of the outcomes and the impact. So that will affect success, but also both the silver lining and a measure of success for us is there has been greater demand, both for our WASH work, our COVID response work, our ability to reach children and families. And so I do believe that the more who step up to incorporate and use this content, everything we do is provided, we want it used as much and as many places as possible. So I think the more it is adapted and incorporated, that could be a silver lining for everyone.
Sherry, thank you. And Shadi, we'll end with you. What is your message to our listeners today as a refugee, speaking to refugees in terms of partnerships and more generally lessons learned or silver linings?
I first want to thank everyone for this really amazing speeches, everyone. And I want to add my voice to Nadia, who said we learned working from distance. Nadia, there are 1% of our world population are now uprooted. They don't leave home. They can work from distance. This is one of the messages for all the private sectors, for all the public and private sectors. But let me admit that this 2020 is extremely challenging and drastic changes. Like, it's a year with full of changes. And inside of that, my message would be to all business leaders, but decisions makers and influencers, to join us in seeing our perspective. This COVID-19 have changed the situation, the conditions for everyone regardless. And this is the same for refugees. So maybe that helps to see our perspectives. We all have a part to play in changing the narrative around refugees and forcibly displaced, both on a personal and professional level. So I'm asking you for your involvement, your reflection in this sense. My kind demand would be, do not see us as numbers only, but as members of society. We're husbands, we're fathers, we're mothers, we're wives, we're everyone at the same time. We're just stories, like or unlike yours. And we want to take part, to play our role in shaping this world for a better for all. And the initiative we did in Geneva, it's a proof for that. We don't want to be put in a box, nor in a camp, nor tagged with an administrative category. We need to be recognized at present and as a history. Our previous work experience need to be recognized. Our previous education need to be recognized. We can't start our life from zero. We can't start over. We need to continue our life. There might be some rupture. And I find myself obliged, I'm sorry, but I find myself obliged to remind myself and everyone that there is no global issue that was solved without international commitment, without a global commitment and solidarity. This forced migration needs international solidarity to be solved. It needs international commitment to be solved. It affects everyone It needs local and global, private and public commitment. UNHCR, who's doing beautiful, all of you are doing beautiful job now. Without the support of everyone, without the will, we can't continue this job we're doing now. Imagine in 10 years, the number double again. What can we do then? One last thing, and speaking of international solidarity, and now here in Syria, instead of a dedicated global solidarity for support to achieve peace, to achieve justice, to achieve security, to achieve dignity for everyone, we are faced with the looming end of a UN security that allows, that authorize a cross-border for humanitarian aid. We're risking an end for humanitarian, basic humanitarian aid for over 5 million. The majority of them are IDPs in northwest and northeast of Syria. And this is grave. It is not acceptable. It is a shame if it would happen. As you leave this meeting, please think of 1%. In any company, in any capital you are, think of 1%. 1% could be a title for a meeting in which you will come up with an idea to inspire all of us. 1%, just 1%. Every action counts.
Yes, Shadi, that said so well, every action counts. And with respect to the UN resolution, I'll circulate some information on that on my Twitter platform later today. A huge thank you to the panelists and to reviewers from me and Kevin. I will just turn it back to you to conclude.
Great, thank you everybody. Thank you to UNHCR for partnering on this conversation. This is actually the end of part 1 of our programming today. Part 2 will start in 11 minutes, where we'll be looking at US asylum policy. So if you're joining now for that, welcome. If you aren't, you're welcome to stay on. But thank you so much to all of our speakers for this conversation. You will all receive an email with the video from this and the report from it as well. So thank you all, and we will see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.